Good evening, Jyoti. Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Gopi, for your sharing. It's always it's always a pleasure. It's always a treat to listen to Gopi. So he's so articulate and very committed to this cause, to the work. And it's people like him that have made a big difference in this struggle, in the ongoing struggle of not only the SOGIAs communities or the LGBTIQA plus communities, but also heterosexual Christians, because we are also affected by this a lot of prejudice that is geared and that is aimed at members of the community. And so it is not only harmful for them, but it's also harmful for us. And so I'm very thankful to Gopi for the sharing as well. And I would like to share my screen again. And oh yeah, yesterday we were running a bit out of time, so and we had to cross the time that we set for ourselves. And right now it's already 6:09, so I'll try to go through very quickly. And before that, I think we should start with maybe if there are any questions or clarifications that we would like to have based on the presentation yesterday and the questions that were raised, or any kind of doubts that you have, that anyone has. You can take the time. Okay, no questions, and we'll just move ahead. Yesterday we stopped at this. I mean, that was the last part that we could deal with John Chrysostom and the church fathers. I'm not going to look at the whole history of the church in relation to homosexuality or LGBTIQA plus communities and our thinking toward it, but rather I'm picking here and there, because it's a very wide area. It's 2,000 years of prejudice that we're dealing with here. So I'm trying to identify only the major influences or the major factors. So we've seen yesterday, or rather we've stopped yesterday with John Chrysostom's legacy, because he's a very important figure in the history of the church, especially Eastern Christianity, which is the Christianity that has such a big impact on Indian Christianity as well. So we'll just look at this legacy that Chrysostom held, that the male passive partner has effectively renounced his manhood and become a woman. And because of that, such kind of individual deserves to be stoned. So this is not only about Chrysostom. It's not only about Eastern Christianity, but it's about us also, because there are many of us, even within our churches, within our communities, within our societies, who still hold on to this kind of belief, because ultimately society being very patriarchal, and with the men calling the shots, we are always scandalized. We find it scandalous to see a male renouncing that privilege or the elevated position that we enjoy in society. So it becomes a big issue for us. And we've seen also that this prompted Allen to say, Chrysostom's learning and eloquence spans and sums up a long age of ever-growing moral outrage, fear, and loathing of homosexuality. Now, homosexuality is just one aspect of it, but for want of a better word, we often use this as a kind of umbrella term for it, for those members of the community and the sexual minorities. And another important character is in the history of Christian thought is Augustine, because Augustine's influence, it still has a very big role. It still has a very big place in us, especially because of the influence that he has on even reformers like Luther. It's not only the early church that Augustine's views and ideas as well as thought has had big impact. It has a big impact on the reformers, the Reformation theology as well. And by extension, it has a big impact on our thinking. So we also have to know a little bit of this. Non-Christian ideas, we see that they have a big role in how Saint Augustine of Hippo, the Bishop of Hippo, formulated his theology. He considered women intellectually, morally, and even physically inferior. And this is at the crux of the matter, the problem, even in many of our societies now, in our cultures. We consider women as intellectually, morally, and even physically inferior, even though the reality is quite different. But then this is the conception that we often have. And for Augustine, this lesser status of women was to be demonstrated even in the act of sexual coercion or coitus, that they should be in the lower position, underneath, facing upwards, and the man should be on top. I hope my voice is clear, because I don't know if it's my connection unstable or because of some other, sometimes a little bit disturbance comes in. Anyhow, I'll just go on. And we know Augustine as the originator of the thought, this original sin. So for him, sex itself is originally sinful, so to speak. It is sinful by its very nature. So he viewed sexual desire as the one human craving that can overcome both reason and will, which is so strong that it makes us senseless, it makes us crazy. That's his understanding. So he believes this, he mentioned that this was a truth that was made evident to him because he himself could not control his sexual urges or give up his concubine, even though he desperately wanted to do so. So this is how he came to this conclusion, that it is sinful. And he believes that it's the result of human sinfulness and disobedience to God. So it's only God's grace that could allow one to overcome this sexual urge and sexual drive, or any other human weakness. And so because of all this, various church leaders gradually becoming very, being very pessimistic about sex and sexual relations, classical Christianity also became strongly kind of anti-sexual. So according to Dale B. Martin, most early Christianity was strongly ascetic. Asceticism in itself was a very important feature of classical Christianity. So majority of Christians for the first many centuries of Christianity apparently assumed that God requires severe control, preferably the complete renunciation of even sexual relations. So when we think of asceticism, we think of usually fasting, prayer, and so on. But then classical Christianity also extended that the ascetic ideal to matters of sexuality and sexual relations. And that they thought that it is something that should be avoided if possible. And if it's not possible to avoid it, then you can indulge in it only for the purposes of procreation. And this is something that comes up again and again, even in the late 19th century, when the term homosexual was created and sort of misused and abused, that we will see later. So this sex for the indulging in sex only for the purpose of procreation, that becomes a very important theme down the centuries. And so there are some takeaways from classical Christian thought, which still has a very important role, which still conditions our thinking so much, that sexuality is usually centered around external genitalia. And it is focused solely on the sexual act. And that too is limited to coitus. We know coitus, like it's the penile, vaginal sexual relationship, not any other sexual acts or not any other expressions of sexuality, but the penile vaginal sex, which becomes another very important feature of even the section 377, which Gopi had referred to earlier. Because in the explanation, if you have read that section 377, the explanation part says that penetration is enough to constitute the crime described there, something like that. I'm paraphrasing it, but it talks of penetration. So the 377 was ultimately constructed around the idea of the male organ, sexual organ, penetrating some other orifice rather than the vagina of a woman. And we often talk of penetrator and penetrative, penetrated and passive, active partners as if sex is only one way or sexual relationship is only one way. But still, it is still very male-centric talk, and very male-centric idea that we still hold, or which many of us still hold. And that another takeaway from classical Christian thought, which still determines our thinking a lot, or which still influences our thinking a lot, is that desire is the result of human sinfulness and disobedience to God. So it's only God's grace that could allow us to overcome it. And then another thinking is the male should never be on the receiving end, and one who is engaging in homosexual acts goes against nature. So these are the kind of thinking that are still being thrown around. And there are attempts to overcome this, and one of which is what is called the ideology of complementarianism. But this also is very problematic. It's supposed to be a solution, but it's not really a solution, but rather a non-solution. It is the ideology that masculinity and femininity are divinely ordained, that men and women are created to complement each other. That is what complementarianism is basically about. It propagates a view of gender that is rooted in the fundamental belief that God designed men and women to function differently. And it asserts that males and females complement and complete each other in their different roles and duties, which seems okay at a cursory glance. But then if you start looking at it, okay, it's advocating an asymmetry in the relationship. And this asymmetry in the relationship between male and female, for instance, is often been misinterpreted and either deliberately or unintentionally giving rise to the idea that God-given unique responsibilities rest or are present in each gender, which the opposite gender doesn't share in the same way, which at a brief glance, it seems okay. But then this kind of understanding, God-given unique responsibilities, for instance, in my church, being a pastor is considered to be a God-given unique responsibility of the male gender. So that's why you don't have pastors and theologians trying to dissuade that kind of thinking. This is generally very strong in the laity. Theologians, pastors, they know that this is not necessarily so. But then, so far, I've not come across any strong effort on the part of a pastor or a theologian to attack it, except for me, maybe. Because 2014, I published a small Bible study in my language, in which I looked at sexuality and this gender minorities as well. And so it's not something that is very often attacked or attempts being made to dissuade people from holding this kind of beliefs. And then moving on, we'll look at words, because words and terminologies, they convey concepts, they convey meaning, and meaning of words are basically concepts which are conceptualized. We can start asking ourselves questions like this. Are we even talking of the same thing when we use terms such as homosexual and heterosexual? So when I speak of a homosexual and heterosexual, I mean a particular kind of person. With earlier, I must confess, I was also very judgmental about homosexuals and homosexuality, but it's a long process of studying and learning and slowly getting rid of all those prejudice that I've had. But then when I use the word homosexual, I usually would refer to someone who is who is sexually attracted or who has a romantic feelings towards at least another member of society who inhabits a body that is outwardly the same sex as him or her. But that also becomes very problematic again, because we've had this the whole understanding of transgender, which is not just a construct, but which is a reality as well. So many of us have not really gone beyond genitalia and behavior when we think of, or when we talk about sex and sexuality. We don't really have any understanding of identity, orientation, and so on. And even though someone points out to us that we don't have this understanding, we still continue to hold on to that. There is the unwillingness to learn, the unwillingness to embrace this knowledge, this understanding that is alien to ourselves, that is alien to us. An unwillingness to go beyond what we know, beyond what we understand, because our minds are already closed. So we are totally oblivious to or in denial of the reality of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression and sex characteristics. SOGIES, which Gopi also mentioned, and which also can have rough parallels with the LGBTIQA+ category that we use in the ASHA NCCI, because this alphabet soup, as we call it sometimes, the positioning of the letters also play a big role. Again, sometimes you will see that the Q comes before the I, but here at Isha, we realize that, okay, the I has to come before the Q, or at least some of us feel that way. So the way the letters are arranged also becomes very strategic as well. And these are things that we need to pay attention to if we are really serious about being just, if we are really serious about being non-judgmental, if we are really serious about being open, being embracing, being loving. So we'll look at a quick look at how the term homosexual comes into our vocabulary. It was created in the German-speaking world. It did not originate in the English-speaking world, but in the German-speaking world by an Austro-Hungarian named Karl Maria Kertbeny. We all know that Austria-Hungary was a big empire before the First World War. So he called it homosexuality. Of course, it is a very crude, a very basic, and a pseudo-scientific description. But still, it has a very important role. It has a big role because it was the first, at least, some first attempt to conceptualize non-binary gender or non-binary feelings and attractions as well as expressions. So that's why it is a very important stage, a very important step in towards our understanding. He first used it in 1868 in a private letter to another lawyer who had come out in 1862. So he used terms like homosexual, heterosexual, monosexual, and heterogenate. So these are terms that he used. And the first non-public appearance of this term, homosexuality or the Homosexualität in German, in print was in 1869, in a pamphlet that advocated the repeal of Prussia's sodomy laws. Prussia, we know that this was the important component of what was the Weimar Republic, the German Empire, and then later now subsumed within the larger Germany. This pamphlet was written by Kertbeny himself and was published anonymously. And then the English word homosexual, the usage of homosexual in English happened in 1892 only. And here I'm reminded of, while doing this, I was reminded of the Oxford English Dictionary, that when we first had that Oxford English Dictionary in the War Memorial Library of Lena Theological College in Jabalpur. Our librarian was Mr. Hamilton. He was so happy to have that when it was delivered, and he proudly called me and brings back very good memories. And one of the first things I did was I checked this word, homosexual, in that Oxford English Dictionary. By the way, Mr. Hamilton is an uncle of our dear Vijayan here today. So sometimes strange, unexpected memories, unexpected things come in, when recollections come in when we do our research. But that's leaving that aside. This term homosexual it entered the English vocabulary in 1892 when C.G. Chaddock translated the work of an Austrian psychiatrist called Richard von Krafft-Ebing. It's called Psychopathia Sexualis, which is a study on sexual practices. Now, this is very crucial because by this time, the term homosexuality itself was already abused. Not only homosexuals themselves, but homosexuality itself was abused, because Kurt Benney initially considered homosexuality as a variation in the spectrum of sexual attraction and or behavior. But then von Krafft-Ebing, who borrowed the term in 1886, considered homosexuality as an aberration, as an anomaly, as a disorder. Of course, he changed the biological term from anomaly to differentiation in the 1901 article. But the damage was already done, because the way it entered the vocabulary, especially in the English-speaking world, to which many of us draw our inspiration, draw our theological resources as well as sources. The way it was being used was with the older usage of von Krafft-Ebing, which was in a sense very judgmental, which considered homosexuality as an anomaly, as an aberration. So this we also have to understand, of course, that he was a product of his time. He considered procreation as the purpose of sexual desire, and that of any form of recreational sex was a perversion of this sex drive. So with the opportunity for natural satisfaction of the sexual instinct, every expression of it that does not correspond with the purpose of nature, that is propagation, must be regarded as perverse. So terminologies or understandings like nature, natural, attraction which is natural, sexual feelings which are natural and which are unnatural have started coming in here. So Krafft-Ebing concluded that homosexuals suffered a degree of sexual perversion because homosexual practices could not result in procreation. And so this kind of understanding fits in nicely with what is called the Victorian morality and prudery, which largely influenced, which has a big impact even in our Indian society and culture, wherever colonialism reached or spread its tentacles. That kind of feeling also went along, because it was at home within what is called the Victorian morality and prudery, which is basically a widespread cultivation of an outward appearance of dignity and restraint. And so behavior, appropriate and inappropriate behavior, dress code, appropriate dress and inappropriate dresses. So civilized, the binary between civilized and non-civilized or uncivilized, all this has come along with this colonial expansion, and it was reinforced by the missionary enterprise. So wherever colonialism went, it carried with it an imposition of Western Christian cultural values, which drew largely from, especially in the English-speaking world, as well as the what may be called the colonies of the British Empire. The Western Christian cultural values, which were strongly, deeply undergirded by Victorian morality and prudery, greatly impacted on our socio-cultural values, and it has far-reaching implications and ramifications for social and community life. It has impact on laws, ordinances, and other legal matters. And even in India, we are still reading under it, because it's not only 377, but 375, for instance, which is still very, very problematic, even though there was in 2013, the government or rather Parliament came up with some reforms with regards to rape and other sexual offenses. But then impact, or rather the legacy of this colonial enterprise is still very strongly felt even now in our laws, in our legal matters. And this is something that we as leaders, as thinkers have to consider. We should be critical. We should be balanced. We should have a proper understanding, or a very proper reading into it. So our discussions of sexuality and homosexuality itself becomes kind of battlegrounds, or rather, instead of a battleground, I would say a place where we hurl socio-cultural and theological abuse, where we build up on those. Because these are ecclesial and political in nature, they are also theological as well. It's not only about being committed Christians and living or being good believers, being godly people, but rather also about trying to stifle dissent, or trying to stifle voices of minorities as well. So we need to pay attention to the history of ideas, the politics of translation that are at work, also translation politics and policies as well. For example, the entry of the word homosexual in the English Bible only in 1946. And then in the German Bible, it's only in 1983, in the place where, in the country, or rather the linguistic world where the term itself was coined. It was only in 1983 that the word entered the Bible. And we have to question this. And there is one documentary that is being prepared. It's called 1946. The impact of mistranslation on a culture, or something like that. I forgot the exact term, but if you look at the word, there is a very important documentary which is an examination of how finally the word was added into the English Bible when translating those very difficult words, arsenokoitai and malakoi. So as theological teachers, as people who influence and shape the minds of so many future leaders of our church, it is important that we ourselves engage in very rigorous academic research into this as well. So it is imperative upon us to undertake a very long, very winding journey to look at how we have come to hold the traditions that we have, how our respective church traditions have come about, and always with a very critical approach, with very critical mindset, and reform those traditions if they need be. Just because traditions are traditions, they don't have to be traditions, or they don't need to be in vogue all the time, but rather we have a role in reforming the traditions themselves, the traditions that we hold dear to. So I'll just put some statements, some paragraphs here by Dale Martin again. And in fact, I will share a small article that Martin himself has written, which is available at the Yale Divinity School website. So I've made a PDF of it, and I will be sharing it through the chat. I think it's possible to share. And it's a prescribed reading, as you can see it here. It's about sex, not homosexuality, the online article. And then another prescribed reading or suggested reading is this. It's a series of books by Kathy Baldock called Walking the Bridgeless Canyon, Repairing the Breach Between the Church and the LGBT Community. This is, it's a multi-part series. It's a very intensive study of how our understanding of homosexuality and the church's attitude towards it has also caused problems as well as hardships to members of to the sexual minorities, and also done harm to the general populace within the church as well. And even though it might be a bit difficult, I think it's still available to read free online in Amazon Kindle. the Kindle edition, which is online reading is free, I think. So I just need to create an account, can access it as well. So thank you very much for listening patiently to me and my ramblings. And so if there are any questions or any clarifications or any discussions that we would like to initiate on our part, then I think we'll open the time. We still have a few minutes. Jyoti. Yeah, is there any questions that have come or any clarifications?
You can even, yeah. Anybody who would like to raise a question, you can just put it in the chat box also. No questions?
So I'm sharing that file, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, it's in the chat box. So it's from the online page only. Just short article, but it is quite, I find it quite good and I find it very challenging. And I think it would be helpful for others as well.
Any questions, please? Yeah, you can initiate a kind of discussion.
Sir, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to thank you so much, sir, for since last 2 days. I would just like to know whether the dualistic ideas of that came from the Greek philosophy on body and soul has any impact on the later generations on the body itself. The dualistic ideas, has it impacted negatively on the idea of body?
Yeah. Christianity or Christian theology has drawn a lot from the surrounding cultures and the ideologies, or rather the philosophical and the religious practices and traditions of surrounding nations and peoples as well as communities. And this is most noticeable in the life and in the mind and the thinking of the Apostle Paul himself, because we know that he is a product of two cultures or two worlds. He was very much a Jew, very much a Hellenist also, and who has all sorts of, I would say he was a very learned man, not only in Jewish religious and legal matters, but also in the Gentile, the Hellenistic education system. So we notice it in his theology as well, in his writings. Naturally, because of this very strong influence or the impact that the Greek philosophical and literary heritage has upon Christian thinking. And because Paul was the first, I would say, highly educated Christian leader. The followers of Jesus himself were shepherds or some fishermen rather, and people who were not very highly educated, people who were not really exposed to this outside world as well as the thinking. But then along came Paul, who looked very much the sophisticated thinker and leader. So it is only natural that his voice is become very loud and becomes very prominent in the New Testament itself. And naturally, what this translated to was that it also had an impact in subsequent Christian leaders and church leaders and thinkers as well. So we drew a lot, we as Christians, or rather the early Christianity drew a lot from the surrounding literary traditions as well as the riches. And so the way we look at the body and the soul, or rather that binary, that dualistic understanding also plays a big role even now, because we have this understanding that very soon or ultimately our souls will go to heaven, even though the body is left behind here. So that thinking ultimately manifested in a kind of a denial of the body, because the body as a weaker, or rather the flesh as not being on the same level, or not being on the same, how would I say it? There's something which is to be left behind, something which is not worthy, but then the soul, the pure soul as something that is the thing, that is the one that that is what Christ himself has come to save. So this kind of thinking is there even in our contemporary Christianity to a certain extent. I mean, that's my take on it. That's my understanding of it. There could be other understanding also, other interpretations. And since this is
John, there is a question on chat box. Where does the church history stands in today's context? Any valid documents or history of present struggles, victories included in history?
Yeah. See, the history of the church is not something that is written by the historians, but rather it is something that is written by the church itself. It's something that is written by the people, the community. And so naturally, if the church, if the community is open to these struggles, or rather the fight against prejudice, the fight against bigotry, then it is going to be written in the life of the church itself. Of course, to put it into words and on paper, that's the task for the scribes. So there is this tendency to convey or to hold on to the idea that this is something for others to do. This is something for the professional historians or the professional writers, the professional theologians to engage in. But rather, it is not. It is something that, this is a struggle in which the common man and the common woman, that the people in the pews have to be invested in. But then, for them to be invested in, it is people like us who have exposure to this kind of thinking, who have exposure to this kind of struggle that is going on in a niche section of the society, who have to bring it to them. Otherwise, as long as we stay quiet, as long as we keep quiet, many people are not going to have it. So I think Jyoti also mentioned yesterday, it's sometimes it's a bit escapist, so to speak, to say that I cannot have any access to these members of the community here. There are many, if only we are willing to open ourselves to it, if only we are willing to embrace this difference. So there are a lot of books that are written, but usually it's mostly Western books, Western literature. It's because in India, there are very, very few books. So when I was writing my book that I published in 2014, and which actually brought me to the attention of the Isha, because during that time, the general secretary at that time was from my church, an ordained minister of my church. So he came to know of it, came to know of the book and the kind of material that I was dealing with, that I was writing. So that's how I became involved with Isha. But when I was doing that also, I found it very, very difficult to locate Indian sources, especially from theology. Of course, now we have a lot in master's level, even doctorate level. People are doing studies on this now, on sexuality and gender diversities. So this, let's hope that more and more will be aware of this, more and more will be willing to invest their time and even give up their long-held, cherished ideas and principles once the realization has come in that we've been holding on to this thing for so long without really being well informed about it.